right, yeah, so, no real intro needed in our part. I think most of y'all see me, I've come up and given talks on, I think Newburgh, North Carolina, Fort Fisher, Palmetto Ranch. So this is yet another one I just want to throw onto the map, the stack. Hey, I just have a bachelor's degree in history. I don't have a PhD or anything like that. But this is my hobby, this is what I like. And once in a while, about once a year, I try to dive into a subject and try and get some data and pull it out and kind of make it a presentation. So you're not going to see any kind of PhD or book level material here, but this is more for general awareness, the things that's going on. That's what we talk about. So today we're going to talk about Fort Pickens. Has anyone even heard of Fort Pickens? Heard of it? Yeah, maybe you've seen it. Yeah, so if you go down on vacation down in Pensacola, you might have seen a sign or something like that, but it's not a huge, massive fort. You know, it's like a Fort Monroe or a Fort Sumter that you all know of with fame. So it's pretty quiet, but we'll talk about it. The interesting thing is that the majority of Americans, just take a remember look at what that looks like. I'll get to what it really looks like here in a little bit. Take a little bit of artistic license. So let's go back, let's review a little bit of Fort Sumter, right? Fort Sumter is what we all know. We all went to school and we all heard. Fort Sumter was the start of the Civil War and what happened. 4:30 in the morning, the Confederates bombarded it. The Union were already getting starved out and they left, and the Confederates started the Civil War. And they lost the fort, they were bombarded, and that's it. Civil War's on, and it's off to the races. You know, now let's just take a look here, and let's take a step back. You know, that's what we're all taught, and that's probably also usually what they just talk about it, that's all you know, and most people go through their lives from 6 years old all the way on to the deathbeds thinking that that's all there is to it. So there's a little more to it, and we're going to dive into it because you guys love history, and this is all the good stuff that we learn, right? Ignorance is not cool. This is a modern day picture of Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter itself was made on a man-made shoal that they built up and they put it up. This is it right now. In 1861, it had much larger walls, just like the picture of the Fort Pickens that I had shown you on it. Over the years after the bombardment, it was knocked down and it got close to World War I. They wanted a lower profile for submarines or enemy submarines that are off the coast. So you'll see that large black portion in the middle. This is a modern part from World War I, World War II era. Same thing you'll see at Fort Moultrie as well, and at Fort Pickens to this day. Obviously, this whole massive thing was not part of Fort Sumter in 1860, and it was just a parade field, right? And if you guys ever get a chance to go out there, you take a little ferry boat and you can go out there. It's a national park, and you can go tour Fort Sumter. It's pretty cool. I highly recommend it. But what are we taught? We're taught 1825 graduate Major Robert Anderson in November of 1860 took charge of all the U.S. forces and the coastal installation batteries around Charleston. He collapsed his forces in a little bit, and became his Alamo. You know, that's kind of what we're taught here. Major Anderson pretty neat. He's actually a Kentuckian. You know, I mean, most people know that. Most people also don't know that his dad was the aide-de-camp of Marquis de Lafayette during the Revolutionary War. His mom was a cousin of the 4th Supreme Court Justice John Marshall. So the guy's got a little bit of history. He was also 55 years old as a major. Nowadays, you look at the modern army and you're like, 55-year-old major? No way, right? But back in those days, promotions were very slower. But come on out, enjoy Fort Sumter if you're out in South Carolina. A little bit of a lay down here. So this is the man-made fort of Fort Sumter. And then over here you have Fort Moultrie. And then over here you have Fort Johnson. Over here you have Castle Pinckney, or Pinckney Armory, or whatever they might call it, came up with different names. And then obviously right here is the city of Charleston, the confluence of two major rivers and going out to the Atlantic Ocean. So Fort Moultrie is actually where the U.S. forces were headquartered. Fort Sumter was hardly ever used. It was almost abandoned. It was built up a little bit, and then it just sat there. But think about it too. If you're having regular, standard, U.S. military forces, you got people coming in, people going out, you want to go out on liberty, you want to go do these things, getting ferried out to a fort is not user-friendly. So Fort Moultrie was where they were at. However, December 26, 1860, secession fever was rolling, right? And Robert Anderson knew that something's not quite right, and it's happening right here in South Carolina, right in my backyard. So he says, my position at Fort Moultrie, up there on the tip of Sullivan Island, is not tenable. I had any kind of land forces, I'm hosed. Plus, I can't really control the harbor. So what he did was he collapsed his forces from Fort Moultrie, moved them all over to Fort Sumter, pretty much evacuated this place. Fort Johnson was pretty much unoccupied anyway, so he didn't use it. So that became the stronghold for the Union forces. Very interesting, December 20th is actually when South Carolina seceded. So then he reinforced 6 days later. You can see the writing on the wall. And he didn't have any clear orders from Washington saying, hey, abandon your position. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Now remember, it was with President Buchanan, was on the tail end of his administration. There was no way that he was going to go to the history books of the guy who surrendered all these forts. So he had already lost some of the other installations in South Carolina. And he's like, there's no way we're going to lose that, right? Especially South Carolina, the heart of the secession movement. So he said, yeah, this is not too cool. How about December 10th? Let's make a truce. A formal truce wasn't signed and say, hey, you don't reinforce Fort Sumter, I want to attack it. Sounds fair? Okay, fine. Remember, the whole purpose of South Carolina seceding was not to start civil war. They just wanted to secede from the Union. They wanted to do it peacefully. So they were all hoping that we can work out a peaceful solution with the United States. There would be no bloodshed, and we can all get along. Just withdraw from the club.
Can't get along with Yankees.
Say again?
Can't get along with Yankees.
Yeah, exactly. So they wanted to just out of the club, right? December 27th, the Governor Pickens, no relation to Fort Pickens at all, asked Major Anderson, hey, Major Anderson, okay, how about this? I kind of view this as a violation of the truce. How about you go back to Fort Moultrie and pretend like this won't happen? And then Major Anderson said, no, I can't do that. And plus, the truce that we had, no terms were ever written, and all I was doing was moving my men. I was not being reinforced. So, depending on how you look at it, okay, who's right, who's wrong, take it for that. But after that, December 27th, after Major Anderson said no, Governor Pickens said, okay, fine. So we're going to start pulling in South Carolina militia into Fort Moultrie, start dusting the cobwebs off Fort Johnson, and we're going to take over Castle Pinckney, which was more like an ordnance depot, an ammunition supply point. So they started doing that. That became it. Anderson was the last, Sumter was his last Alamo for that area. We're also taught to, some folks out in America may understand that January 9th, the Star of the West had kind of come in here to try to resupply Fort Sumter, but it was shot at by some cadets from the Citadel, turned around and left. So, pretty interesting, right? Why did they do that? Okay. Lincoln was actually inaugurated on March 4th. Remember, it wasn't January 20th like it is today, so it was a little earlier in. So, I'm not a big fan of Lincoln at all. In fact, I think the guy really just crushed the Constitution, was part of the biggest tyrant the country's ever seen for what he did. But I will say this, on his defense, he was handed a terrible sandwich by Buchanan. Hi, South Carolina just seceded on the tail of my watch. Hotbed going on at Fort Sumter. Here's your baby now. I'm out of here. You know what I mean? So, what's Lincoln going to do? And Lincoln's new to this, so he's got an advisor telling him all sorts of different things. We'll find out a little bit later on why Sumter was not his only option there. Let's see. What people don't know is on April 5th, he was actually, the Powhatan supply ship was ordered to go in and reinforce Fort Sumter. So that was put out before Fort Sumter's attacks ever happened, but let's just jump on to it. So we know that on April 12th, General Beauregard got the green light from the Confederate Secretary of War, Leroy Pope Walker, the grandson of Leroy Pope from Huntsville with a nice big old house. And he said, if they don't surrender, you can level it. And that's what he did. So 4:30 in the morning on April 12th, General Beauregard ordered the firing, and it was fired from Fort Johnson, Fort Moultrie, floating batteries, and anything where they could get to was all engaging on Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was woefully undermanned, and they just got bombarded. Then we also know that on April 13th, they said ceasefire, they lowered their flag. April 14th, Major Anderson and his forces actually left. So that's just a general, real quick refresher of what they did from January to April 13th, 14th, okay?
When they lowered their flag, they were allowed to be excavated, they were allowed to leave.
They lowered their flag as a term that they surrendered, but they were not evacuated from the fort the next day.
Okay, but I mean, we didn't capture them and keep them, we just said go home.
Yes,
Okay.
leave, right? Up until that point, it was bloodless. So there was still a possibility to maintain the peace. The first casualty of the Civil War was actually when they surrendered. They were going to do a 100-gun salute. Around 47, Private Daniel Huff, the gun went off, killed him instantly, and mortally wounded another guy. So it wasn't really due to the bombardment at all, you know. But Huff is buried was buried on the parade grounds out there. But now, so okay. That was an accident, you know what I mean? So still no blood loss. Let's see what we can do to preserve the peace.
I have one question.
Yep.
In this whole area, the Union had no naval support or any bases or harbors or anything like that?
Harbors and stuff? No,
Yeah.
not here in Charleston. They no, because at this point, there were still some coastal installations further north in North Carolina.
Right.
But in Charleston, this was it. So, pretty interesting, you know. So that's what people know, and you dive into it a little bit. You go out to the National Park Service, and that's kind of the tour that you get. You find out about it, but that's pretty cool. But what I wanted to tell you, people don't know, is that 555 miles away in Pensacola, Florida, almost the exact same thing was happening at the exact same time. There's a very good chance that the Civil War could have started in Pensacola, Florida. By pure chance, error, whatnot, it actually started here. So, pretty cool. Let's dive in and let's take a look. This thing keeps popping up. It's going to
Check it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you guys got down on Fort Gaines, Fort Morgan, Orange Beach, whatnot, coastal Alabama. So obviously this is Alabama right here. Here's Mobile, and here is Pensacola, sharing the border. That we like to look at it. Let's go back to Pensacola. Who cares about Pensacola and why Pensacola, right? Well, Pensacola was actually the very first settlement in the New World. Official settlement, right? The Spanish actually came in 1559, had a settlement, and then eventually the settlement folded and it went away. Pensacola actually came back in 1698 and has been in continuous use since 1698. However, you guys look at history and trivia, St. Augustine is the oldest continuous European settlement in America, right? Well, Pensacola was founded 6 years before St. Augustine, but because they evacuated Pensacola, they lost their chance of being continuous. So St. Augustine became 6 years, right? Just remember to put it in context here, after St. Augustine was founded, 42 years before Jamestown, that's when Pensacola was founded. You know, 55 years before Plymouth Rock is when Pensacola was founded. So who cares about Pensacola, right? Pensacola is actually very interesting because there's a natural inlet, it's a natural choke point. You come into a fairly deep harbor, and it's deep all the way up here until you get to the Bayou Grande area. So you can take ocean-going sailing vessels and sail them right in. You can actually maneuver inside the bay. It was deep enough for those guys. So the Spanish loved the protected harbor because they were at war with the French and the British, and they could put their ships inside there safely, and then they could see them and they could move them out if they need to. And then for light storms, it provided a form of protection with a natural barrier island. So Pensacola was really cool. Now, same thing in Civil War, right? So we have the Mexican War that was going on, and then the Civil War, we were still using sailing ships and things like that. Very nice, you can maneuver in, around with the wind. But the cool thing is about the Civil War, the U.S. Navy had also had a massive dry dock system right here so they could dry dock ships. Very, very good. Cold weather, not a factor. It does nice over, so it's pretty good, right? Let's go over a little bit more here in this red box that we're looking at. All right, Pensacola area, this area, there was 4 masonry forts, 376 cannon, 17,000 projectiles, and 52,000 pounds of gunpowder. A lot more than what they had at Fort Sumter. So militarily speaking, Pensacola Harbor in that area was more important than Charleston. Politically, it's not the same. You know, Florida hadn't voted to secede and things like that. Plus, Maryland, find Pensacola on a map, maybe. Find Charleston, definitely, right? Major ocean port for commerce as well. Pensacola, not so much, but it was a fantastic military one. And it was the deepest port for the U.S. Navy on the entire Gulf Coast. Deeper than Mobile. Mobile gets shallow in some parts, it's very hard to navigate. Pensacola, you can sail right in, so much more important. All right? Okay, so as we're seeing here, here is a couple of major forts to point out. Fort Barrancas, which was actually founded by the Spanish, abandoned, came back, reinforced, built up, and whatnot, but in complete use during the Civil War. Fort McRae was over here, and then Fort Pickens was right there. All 3 of them created a trifecta, right? A nice Venn diagram of defending Pensacola Harbor, and including this dry dock area right here in the Warrington Naval Station. Pretty cool, it all worked out pretty good. But let's start taking a look at what happened there. All right, this is a modern day look of what you got here. This is modern day Fort Pickens. You remember the tile slide? It looks like it had huge walls and stuff. Those walls are actually 40 feet. They're still there. However, during the Civil War, it had a 20-foot drop for a dry moat. So when the guy took his lithograph, you know what I mean, it did 40 feet, but he didn't really show the moat. But realistically, 20 feet from the surface up. Fort Barrancas right here, as you can tell, it's a masonry fort, and this is what they call the water battery for any close-in ships that came in. You could actually shoot over that water battery that's recessed a little bit. So I would say this, if you guys haven't been to Pensacola, Florida, McRae is gone, is now just sand. You can't go see that. But Fort Pickens, you sure can. It's a national park system. And Fort Barrancas, you can go see, but it's on board the Naval Air Station, so you require base access to get on. Of course, there's visitor passes and things like that, if you guys want to go check out Barrancas. Barrancas itself is very well preserved.
Also a really good Air Force museum there.
Yeah, the Naval Aviation Museum.
Yeah.
Yep. Really good, really my favorite, of course, right? I was a Naval Air, I was a Marine Corps helicopter pilot. So some of my helicopters hanging up there in the museum. I'm getting old now, I guess. But yeah, so you can go out there and you can tour Barrancas. Further up north, they had Advanced Redoubt, which was a defense for many landward attacks that came in there. So Pensacola at the time was pretty good. Also, when you think about the Mexican War, all the ships coming out from Mexico, resupply, refit, and everything like that, Pensacola was pretty good. Very important strategically speaking. Barrancas had about 51 men, one company of Army artillery that had it there. Okay, at McRae, it was an ordnance sergeant and his wife, and it was an ammunition supply point. Not much action there, no real guns put in place. The guns were actually over for Barrancas, because just like at Fort Moultrie in South Carolina, Pickens is on an island. This was actually abandoned since the Mexican War. All the U.S. forces were at Fort Barrancas and the area nearby, because you get to it, go on Liberty, go home, things like that. Right? Okay. So now I'm on the stage. We'll talk briefly about the secession feeling and the fever that was going on at Fort Sumter. Now, let's go back here here's my disclaimer. There's a lot that happened, and I didn't want to do a 1,000-slide presentation. This kind of nuts. So I put some stuff on here with some bullets to kind of capture a couple of things at a time, just to paint the picture, and you can see the progression of how things go. If you guys are really interested, there is a lot of internal discussion about what happened in Washington, D.C., and some of the trickery that was going on between the Secretary of the Navy, General Scott, Abraham Lincoln, and Seward as well, to try and get this into war. Okay, unfortunately, if I tried to present that to you, it would be like an episode of Game of Thrones, and you guys would be like, what the heck is going on? It's confusing. I will screw it up. You'll be more confused, so I'm not even gonna do it. So it's on you on the political side. I just want to stick to the military side and give a little bit of history of Fort Pickens. Okay. This one I use as an example, USS Supply. A Navy lieutenant came on board and went on shore in Pensacola, and he found out that the whole town was a talk of secession. Secession fever was rapid in Pensacola. Very few Union sentiments in Pensacola. A little further out east there was some, you know what I mean? But it was a hotbed for secession. So, newspapers, balls, dinner, out in the town, that's what they were talking about. That's as early as December 7th, so think about it, right? I mean, South Carolina was seceded December 20th, right? So, okay, this is gonna happen. But January 3rd, secession convention convened in Tallahassee. I think it took 2 votes on it, but it was ready to go, you know. Then January 4th, Mount Vernon Arsenal in Alabama was seized by Alabamian forces. Why do we care about that? Because Mount Vernon was the supply point for naval projectiles, naval gunpowder, and everything that came to Fort Pickens and Fort Brangus. So when this happened, it forces that for like, we got what we have, and I cannot probably get any more in case we go to a shooting war. This is what we have.
Where is Mount Vernon?
It's a little bit north of Mobile. Not sure exactly how far. It was a hospital for a while. It's all abandoned now, I think. I don't even know if you can tour it. Anyone been there? I haven't. It's on my to-do list when I go down to Citronelle. Go check out those surrender site. Then, of course, next day, Fort Gaines and Fort Morgan were seized by Alabamian forces. So at this point, something's happening around here. If you're a U.S. force and you want to see what's going on, you hear what's going on over at Fort Sumter or Charleston, and you're thinking, man, this is right happening in my backyard, right? So we'll put you in a little bit of a position here. So this is from the old 6th law of the Navy. It's pray for relief for the good of service as much as often as can be. You know what I mean? They have a whole bunch of other, they all rhyme. And it's all the goodness of the things of the Navy. It was actually founded like in 1918 by a British Navy, but the U.S. Navy took it off. And I was forced to memorize that when I was at the Naval Academy. But leave is good is what they're getting at. You know what I mean? Take leave. Good for you, good for your men. You could take a break, recharge your batteries. So, at this point, U.S. Army, Coastal Installation Artillery, the commanding officer, the executive officer, and the engineer, the top 3 guys of all the Army forces, not the Navy guys who were in Warrington, but 3 guys decide they're going to take leave near the Christmas holidays. Just let me ask you a question. If you were in charge of these guys, knowing all that secession movement, would you allow them to go on leave? What do you think?
No.
Wrong! Leave is approved, gentlemen. Out the door. You go out and have fun with your families. Woohoo! So they left.
Go to Panama City.
So the
Brain break.
So this is my question. We find out later on that Major John Winder, right, that he was a Confederate. He became a Confederate very shortly thereafter this, and he became the commanding general of the Libby prison up in Richmond, and then eventually in 1864 Andersonville, right? He knew what was going on, but did he take leave so he wouldn't be the guy who surrendered the forces? I don't know. Me personally, if he was smart, he should have stayed there and then surrendered the forts, right, to the Confederacy. But for some reason, he took leave. Now, I will say this. He was an older gentleman. He had graduated West Point in 1820. So he was probably in his upper 50s. You know what I mean? So he's like, I'm going to go on leave because I want to go on leave. I'm going to go. Very interesting. I don't know what was the deal, what happened on that one, but it's pretty cool. Actually, this is funny too. The engineer, he was on leave up in New York when Fort Gaines and Fort Morgan, and he read about it in the newspapers. He was like, I better get back down to Pensacola. And he jumped on the train and started making it down to Pensacola. But yeah, pretty interesting. Who would have thought? Oh man. Okay, so with the top 3 guys gone, you only have 2 officers left. This guy, the senior first lieutenant, Adam Slemmer, 1850 graduate from West Point, so a little younger definitely a lot younger than Major Winter, 30 years below on West Point, right? And then the next other guy was Lieutenant Gilman in 1856. Now, at some point, he was a West Point instructor, and he actually taught Gilman, so pretty interesting. But yeah, so those 2 officers, though, the officers in charge were responsible for the Pensacola Harbor. Next door to him was Commodore James Armstrong. He was a 66-year-old Navy. If you guys are not familiar with Commodore, it's a rank kind of between captain and admiral. You're not an admiral, you're a very senior captain, and you're in charge of multiple things. But it's more of a title and not a rank. That's why you won't see any kind of organizational charts. That's good. Okay, so what happens here? On January 8th, these guys are feeling it. Slemmer's left in charge, and he's like, hey, I got people kind of like all over the base and stuff. I'm gonna see what I got and get a good inventory. He collapsed all his forces over to Fort Barrancas. Fort Barrancas, come on in. I want a powder, a list of all the powder, the guns, a good inventory. Let's get all this together. He found he had 46 men in his company, right? Because there were other folks who were on leave too. So, not just the top 3. So he had 46 men. And he said, you know what, this is good, this is not good, but what do I have? Okay, I need some time to think. So he's there. While he's there, rather interesting, well, it's not really, 4:30 in the morning, between the 8th and the 9th, some civilians wanted to come and check out Fort Barrancas. And they came up to it, they were probing the lines a little bit, they fired a shot. Everybody woke up and they fled. Very interesting. Okay. So now at this point, this guy's like, okay, something's really definitely happening. I gotta do something a little better than this. That evening of day 2, this gentleman, Colonel Chase, who I'll get into in the next slide, he actually came up and said, hey, you need to surrender Fort Barrancas. I've got Alabama and Floridian militia, and we're gonna take over this place. So with that, with the probing that night and the next day, him and the Commodore on the 9th get an order saying, hey, take everything you can to safeguard the forces and the equipment and everything in the Pensacola area. So that's what they did on January 9th, working in conjunction with the Navy guys. Slemmer elects to abandon Fort Barrancas and go to Fort Pickens, just like Major Anderson did over at Sumter. And the Navy at first was fighting him, but he has to get out to the island. He starts getting everything he can. Navy guys, there were some secessionists favoring sailors. They were sabotaging some of the little motors and everything and dragging their feet and everything. So this guy is trying his best to get over to Fort Pickens and fortify it. Rough, right? And also too, on that night too, just remember the Star of the West was also fired upon. So they didn't hear about it at that point, obviously, but they knew something was going on. Mississippi decides to secede that day too. I gotta suspect that they knew what was going on. Next day, Florida, after voting, decided to secede as well. Now this guy's definitely on his own, right? He has moved up from 46 men up to 80. He was able to get a couple officers and about 30 sailors from the Commodore Armstrong, and then get over to Fort Pickens. So realistically, he has 80 men for the size of that fort. You guys saw Fort Pickens, how big it is. 80 men is nothing, right? Starts getting all his guns, start getting everything over there, moving powder, sabotaging, spiking guns if you can't move it and everything. But you really only had about, 50 guns perhaps at that point. Barely had, what some of those sailors who went with him, totally untrained. So he barely had enough people to man one trained person per gun. Totally, he was not well set, but that's all he had. And now he was hoping for time to kick in and go on the side, right? Let's see. January 11th, Alabama secedes, and troops start arriving right outside the gate, right? And he's seeing all this, and he can see all this from Fort Pickens. And he's like, oh man. But you know what? The U.S. flag is still flying from the Warrenton Naval Air, the Naval Station.
Those troops arriving, Alabama State troops?
Militia from Alabama and Florida, more from Alabama. But we're talking, this is the beginning of the war. this is every person who's angry and has a rifle shows up. And we'll elect one guy to be our colonel. Like, man, you have a company size, that guy's a captain. Oh, okay, whatever. You know what I mean? That's kind of the militia that was showing up outside. But it's forces. All those guys who showed up all ended up falling under this guy, Colonel William Chase. Colonel Chase took charge, and he was appointed by the Florida government to be the militia colonel. Right? Now, this is an interesting story about this guy. This guy, he was chosen for this job because he was the premier engineer for the U.S. Army who built all these forts and fortifications, Fort Gaines, Fort Morgan, and everything. But his primary baby was building Fort Pickens. He himself was an 1815 graduate, so 62 years old at this point. This is funny. He served in the Army as an engineer, right? And he retired in 1856. He retired because somebody in Washington, D.C. found out this guy, after 1819, he went down to the South. He married a very wealthy Southern lady, came up on a whole bunch of land, and started all these businesses. Oh, and he has a 6,000 acre plantation and a whole bunch of other stuff. So this guy's rolling in the cash. He never wanted to leave the area. He had to manage his assets. So they said, guess what? Congratulations, you've been selected to be the commandant at West Point. Just like what the superintendent at West Point, just like General Lee was and everything. And he said, oh, I can't do it. My health is too frail. If I go up there in that cold weather, it'll be bad for me. I gotta stay where it's warmer. It's like, he really needed to stay where his assets were to manage his businesses, right? But interesting, so when he was put in charge, he was told to build Fort Pickens. Contracting world then versus contracting world now. This guy's like, oh, okay, it's going to be a masonry fort? Fantastic. See what I'm going to do. I'm going to build my own brick kiln. I'm going to make my bricks, and I'm going to sell them to myself. And we're going to use my bricks to build Fort Pickens. Okay, they don't care. The U.S. government says make it happen. I don't really give a crap. This is your money. So that's what he did. So this guy was a businessman who was also a naval officer for a little bit, but rather interesting in what he did. But regardless, after he resigned because they didn't want to go to West Point, that's when they came back and brought him on board because he knows the most. He built Fort Pickens. He knows everything about it. Right? Oh, and this flag you see, this was the provisional flag that he designed. Or he didn't say he designed. He plagiarized. This is actually the Republic of Texas Navy flag. 1836, 1845, Texas was his own country. You can see elements of the Bonnie Blue flag. Somebody had a Bonnie Blue hat right there. Right, that was brought into it. So he just used it. That's pretty cool. But again, the next day, he, with all those guys who formed up, marched on over into Warrenton Naval Station and said, surrender the naval yard. And they did. Like in 30 minutes, the U.S. flag went down, his provisional flag went up, and it was good. Ta-da! Easy, not shot fired, right?
How many people did the Naval Yard have?
Not that many. Yeah, remember they already sent 30 sailors over there to Fort Pickens. So those guys were gone, so the Navy guys didn't have, they were, let's put it this way, they were well undermanned. I think they had 2 Marines to guard the gates, and there were like 3 or 4 gates. Couldn't even, it was bad. Makes you wonder, why is it they didn't fortify these things earlier? Well, it is what it is, but. Well, the other thing the cool thing about Chase is that he was actually from Maine. He was a Maine man, but obviously when he moves out south, he became a very Southern sympathizer because his wife and all her family, you know what I mean? And that was his baby. Okay. Pickens surrender number 1. At that point, too, after the naval yard fell, 4 gentlemen who were there at the naval yard who did this, Mr. Ebert, Captain Randolph, Major Marston, Lieutenant Rutledge, approached over to Fort Pickens and said, on behalf of the governors of Alabama and Florida, we request that you surrender Fort Pickens. And then Lieutenant Summers like, no, I don't speak to or engage with civilians who are impromptu, self-made ambassadors for the states, and plus I'm a federal guy. Even if you were, I do not talk to a state government. So they went away. So that was Pickens' request of surrender number 1. All right. Next day, Captain Ferrand and his XO, this is Ebenezer Ferrand, he was the XO behind Commodore Armstrong for the Washington Naval Yard there in Pensacola. He resigned and he went to the staff as well, another northern from New Jersey. And then he's like, I'm a big fan of states' rights, so he left. Interesting. But so that night on the 13th, there's some probing the lines over in Fort Pickens. So over on Santa Rosa Island, some folks, we don't know exactly who they were, militia more than likely, or some citizens all mixed in, started probing the lines at Fort Pickens. And they fired a shot into Fort Pickens. Fort Pickens returned fire on them. They fled. Thunderstorm, night, confusing, nobody knows exactly who or what it was. But it did happen on the evening of the 13th, or morning of the 14th, however you want to look at it. All right. Came back, Colonel Chase now goes over to Fort Pickens and officially requests surrender as a colonel in the Florida militia requesting to surrender. He says, Slumber said, well, let me think about it. It's actually funny. There's actually a dialogue and discussion when Slumber shows up. And Slumber says, I built this fort, I know what it can do, and I have men that can take it. And then Slumber replied, maybe, how many forces do you have? Chase told. You know what I mean? Slumber goes, maybe, they might be able to do it, but it'll be a gallant try. Come back if you really want it, but we're not surrendering. So they actually have a little play. Remember that guy, that Lieutenant, the other Lieutenant Gillum was there, was actually writing it all down furiously, and they did a play on it afterwards and what happened. But oh well. Chase went away. Slumber had called his bluff, and he didn't surrender Fort Pickens. Okay. 18th is actually a good thing though, because Montgomery came back and they telegraphed Colonel Chase, and they said, hey, you know what? Fort Pickens is not worth one drop of blood to our cause. We're still looking for peaceful secession, right? January 18th, everyone's still walking on eggshells. Don't start shooting. Don't want this. So Chase was like, okay, got it. And again, up until this point too, I remember I came in and they asked him to surrender. There was no gunfire, there was no threats. It was very cordial because they all wanted to avoid it. But that telegraph made it very obvious from the government civilian officials that they did not want any bloodshed on it. Okay. January 20th, Washington says, Captain Vogdes, you are tasked to go ahead and take charge of all the Fort Pickens forts, because I have a lieutenant down there. Take another company, reinforce it, take charge, it's on you, right? So they say, okay. He starts manning his force and getting them ready to go. You can't just get a whole company in a minute's notice. So they start doing it. Come out of Fort Monroe, out of Virginia. Yeah, Fort Monroe, and then they start heading on down. They sailed out actually January 24th, so that's not too bad to get everyone ready to go, get them on the ship, get the ships ready, and things like that. People see them leave out of Virginia, and then Senator Mallory from Florida finds out about it and sends a note to President Buchanan and says, hey, I know you guys, and we all know you guys just ordered a reinforcement of Fort Pickens. That's not a good idea. Remember what we're doing right now at Sumter, where it's a kind of truce? Don't let those guys land, because you're going to start a civil war. So Buchanan's like, okay, sounds good. I like it. We'll intercept them before they land and tell them not to land their troops. They can do that. And that's what Buchanan did via the Secretary of the Navy, out to the Navy ships. Now, those ships already left, so they have to either send another ship faster to catch up to them, right? Or send a courier via rail inland, meets them, and sails out and meets them before they can land their troops. So hard. Nowadays, if you want to talk to a ship, you literally pick up a phone and you call the ship. Email, text, whatever, right? Now, those days, a little harder. Okay, so basically, I'm saying on the 26th, Slemmer is over there at Fort Pickens, and he just Colonel Chase requests permission to get fresh fruits and vegetables sent to my position and my men. Chase is like, approved. There's not guns or anything in there, right? You know what I mean? They're still very cordial, and they're trying to get this done. And knowing fresh fruits and vegetables actually rot, it's not like they're doing hardtack or something that's going to keep for a long time. So Chase lets him do it. When President Buchanan had sent out that order, it was after Slumber's 33rd birthday. Very interesting. Okay. So this is funny. Captain Boggs lands. He's met by a Navy lieutenant that says, "You can't land your forces. There's a truce going on right now." He's like, "Wait, what? No way." And then he's like, "Okay, hold on, I'm gonna wait a little bit. Can I go ashore and inspect the forts that I'm supposed to take over?" And then Colonel Chase was like, "Of course, it's just a party, I'm a landing party, no big deal." So he goes in and sees the tire conditions that Slumber's working on, trying to keep it, but it is what it is, and they knew that, and but it was all right. Slimmer actually starts putting cannon up. Chase calls him out and says, "Hey, take it easy, sport. Not arming his cannon yet." Okay, good. Slimmer pulls him back in. Reinforcements finally get there as well from the rest of Captain Boggy's party because he arrived, the rest of his ships didn't, and they end up starting coming in here, along with Navy ships. And this guy, Navy Captain Adams, 06 type, right? He actually becomes the head officer in charge for the landing area because he's the senior most guy. Not an army captain like Israel is. So he's like, okay, and he gets the report that they're not allowed to land men. Very interesting, all right. Lincoln obviously not right there, and then here, Braxton Bragg gets his orders to take over, and we're gonna start pumping you a lot more men at that point. So Colonel Chase was a militia colonel, he's kind of temporarily holding it. Montgomery dispatches Bragg to actually become the senior guy. And he ended up later on arriving on the 11th, not on this slide here. Right? But you think about it though, Bragg's forces are now starting to pile up. And Pickens is not. Okay. They find out about it and they're like, hey, Washington finds out that Boggs didn't land because there was a truce. So then General Scott, talking to Lincoln, says, "I can't land these guys." So Lincoln's like, land them, right? At that point, on March 12th, Lincoln knew that he was violating the truce, and he didn't care. Of course, he's new, he's getting all his inputs from all these guys, and he says, just do it. So Scott screwed up, and he details the orders from General Scott to Captain Boggs to land his men, and sent it, right? Now later on here, this is grumpy face Scott over here just talking, and he ended up change of heart. He originally wanted to take it by force and everything like that, and then he actually came back and he told Lincoln just abandon it. It's not worth the bloodshed. Start changing his mind. Lincoln administration says no, we're in this. So Scott shut up, and they pushed him aside. It is what 60 years of military service or whatever he had. But regardless, the orders that landed him to get ashore come back on the 31st, down in Pensacola. So Boggs is like, I got orders to go ashore. And Captain Adams says, hold on a second, let me see those orders. They're from General Scott. I've got these set of orders from the Secretary of the Navy saying don't go ashore. My orders are more senior than your orders, so you're not going anywhere. I'm not authorizing you to get your guys off my ships. So if Scott had put the order from the president, March 31st, those troops would have landed and the Civil War would have kicked off in Pensacola. So, administrative screw up on the general staff, yeah. Keen eye by Captain Adams, who looked at that and knew those things, yeah. Captain Adams said, okay, this is kind of weird. And he actually fired back a message to Washington saying, hey, please clarify here, because I'm confused and I didn't let these guys land. Right? Accelerate me, but what's going on? So a little bit of confusion there. Also on that day, President Lincoln authorized a Sumter relief force. Again, knowing full well that the truce that was going on, he's violating it. So he violated two truces, Pensacola truce and the South Carolina truce. Didn't care. So those people who love to say Lincoln waited to the South to fire the shot, the first shot, so he could say the South started the Civil War. That's kind of true. Lincoln was kind of hoping the South had started, so he wouldn't have that on his mind. But at the same time, at this point, he was willing to start it. And he was willing to start it at 2 different locations. Okay. Now, after word gets back that Captain Adams is a little confused, they dispatch this guy, John Warden, carrier, single guy, no written message. All in his brain, he memorized it in case he ever got caught, which he did. And went through Montgomery, rail, over to Pensacola, which I'll get into in a little bit here, but this is when he left. Now, at the same time, we're getting closer, April 12th, right? We're getting a lot closer. Things are brewing both in South Carolina and in Florida. Leroy Pope Walker, Confederate States Secretary of War, authorizes Beauregard to level the fort, right? Just like we talked about at the very beginning. South Carolina newspapers tip off the attack, so everyone knows that it's coming just very soon. We don't know exactly when. Ironically enough, 500 miles away in Pensacola, Braxton Bragg that had a force of 5,000 men now at this point at Fort Bragg, this area, says, you know what, we're not waiting for this. I have my orders as well saying to safeguard these 4 forts, I'm going to attack Fort Pickens and take it. And he was going to do a night attack on the 11th, but someone in the press found out about it, printed it off, and Bragg, instead of just doing it, hesitated. He didn't launch those men. Because then he was like, well, the element of surprise is gone, you know what I mean? He didn't know exactly how many people they had at Fort Pickens, but he had 5,000. He had 5,000, but he didn't have a lot of siege guns. He didn't have anything like that. He had maybe some ladders and some muskets and or rifles, and that's about it. So, very interesting. But the newspaper tipped off both places around the same day almost. Very interesting. Now, Warden arrives via rail at Pensacola, but he can't get out to the ship at that point because the sea states are bad. Then, right, he finally gets out there on the 12th. Now, I don't know if word had gotten from Charleston to Pensacola on the 12th at that point, but Warden actually presents himself to General Bragg. He says, sir, request permission to go to Fort Pickens. I have a message for the commander. And Bragg said, well, is it of a military? And he says, no, it's peaceful administrative stuff. So Bragg's like, go ahead. So, I'm sorry, not out to Fort Pickens, but out to the ship, to Captain Adams. And basically Warden tells Captain Adams, hey, you know that order you've gotten from General Scott that said land the troops, that's actually from Lincoln. We screwed it up. Land the troops. And then Warden, after he delivered that message, went back and hightailed it out of the South. And he was actually caught in Montgomery because the Confederate States found out that this guy might have been passing some information to start a civil war. And he was held there as a prisoner for a little bit. But regardless, April 12th. Funny thing too, the Confederate States started shooting at 4:30. Right? You guys are already covered. What a lot of people don't know is those orders that Lincoln had put out saying to resupply Sumter arrived on April 12th at 6 in the morning. They pulled into the harbor and they see that Sumter's getting shot. And they're like, well, we're not going in there. So Sumter was actually also going to get provisioned on April 12th. The South just pulled the trigger a little bit earlier than the North did. But very interesting. And then, of course, later on that night, Vargas lands his troops on the 12th. But at that point, the Civil War had already kicked off. All right. Very interesting. So we start March 31st, where it could have kicked off, and now we're here. So now what, right? I'm not going to go, I've talked enough, I'm not going to go into any more about the rest of Fort Pickens or its Civil War history. You guys can take a look at that. But eventually, another force with Colonel Brown arrived later and really reinforced it with a lot of people. So there was no way Bragg down with his 5,000 men are going to be able to take it really easy, especially a defended position, where they could see on all directions 5,000 men coming to him, you know what I mean? So Bragg did not start the attack in April. He waited, right? A couple of skirmishes that you see here, September 2nd and the 4th, that were going on back and forth. And then they finally ordered, they called the Battle of Santa Rosa Island, which is the island that Fort Pickens and it failed because they had pickets out there. Pickets saw them, shot, retreated back, and then the guns aimed. Didn't really work out too well. So at the end of the day, the Union held Fort Pickens for the duration of the Civil War. And it denied the South access to the Pensacola Harbor, right? The best military harbor on the Gulf Coast. So you had to go to Mobile or elsewhere, New Orleans perhaps.
So they had to keep supplying it throughout the war from the sea.
And they could.
Yeah.
They could, because there were some guns at the South had put some guns at Fort McRae and Fort Barrancas, but Barrancas guns could outrange the ocean, the Gulf of Mexico. Fort McRae's guns could, but then as soon as the Navy ships could put Fort Pickens between McRae and the ships, they could land guys all day long, you know, being support the troops. So, just stay there. Fort Pickens is actually primarily known for the prisoner place of Geronimo. If you ever go out to Fort Moultrie, like over in South Carolina, they had Osceola, the Navy Seminole chief for the prisoner. Well, Fort Pickens had Geronimo for a few years. Rather interesting, right? So in 1886, that's when Geronimo came. His family got moved somewhere else, but then they moved him back. And in 1887, tourists were coming all to Fort Pickens to see Geronimo. Geronimo became a sideshow. They were charging people 50 cents for an adult, 25 cents for a kid to come in and see Geronimo.
Look at Geronimo.
Yeah, go watch. Geronimo came to you, you can come see him, right? But it's not very interesting. They had 459 tourists on one day at one point in the peak, but on average about 20 tourists a day to go see Geronimo at Fort Pickens. Oh well. Poor Geronimo spent about 23 years of his life there before he got moved inland. I think up to Mount Vernon, actually, Mount Vernon, Alabama, and then eventually to Oklahoma. And he died of yellow fever and pneumonia, I think. But interesting. Here's Pensacola today. Obviously, the home of the Blue Angels. I'll show you a picture. The Barrancas area is Naval Air Station in Pensacola, where I went when I was a flight student way back in 1998, 99, back in the old days. But you can still see the Blue Angels practice there. You can Google the Blue Angels practice schedule, and you can go for Naval Air Station and watch them practice. So you get a free air show. Plus you go to the Awesome Museum down there too, right? It's right next to the field. And this is where the Navy trains all their backseaters, navigators, bombardiers. We call it the Forrest Sherman School for the Blind, because it's Forrest Sherman Field, but because they're all their glasses. Pilots, let's crack the jokes on them. But here's Fort Pickens. Obviously, you can see in Fort Barrancas in pristine shape. You can go see them today. Highly recommend you do. There's a whole bunch of stuff that I looked at. And then here's a quick overhead imagery. Gulf of Mexico here. Naval Air Station right here where you can see these guys. The museum is probably right over here, I believe. Here's Fort Pickens. And then Fort Barrancas is about right there, somewhere around here, off the road. You can see it. The advanced readout is still there. You can see that as well. But the Warrenton Naval Yard is right here, and this is where the dry docks were that you can go to. You can see all the Naval Air Station. Pretty cool. All right. Any questions?
I got a question. If there were a modern war against somebody with a big time navy, like China or somebody, would old forts like this have any use to us at all? Or are we just so far past that?
Yeah, I think with the onset of missiles, cruise missiles, we don't even need those are obsolete. They just become targets. You know what I mean? That you can easily neutralize. Not even worth it. Let's just put them underground or something.
I remember a little vague about it, but I remember something about Fort Pulaski demonstrated how vulnerable these masonry forts were to rifle cannon. They just shoot right through the walls.
Yep. Yeah.
And so they were pretty much obsolete at the time. Because as long as you had a big rifle cannon, you could just shoot right through the walls. You didn't have any dirt in back behind them.
Yeah, so we guys hear when I talk about Fort Fisher, North Carolina? Fort Fisher was made dirt, right, sand. So you put a rifle round in the sand, it's just gonna stop it. You know, remember you're right, a masonry fort, poof, go right into it, and then eventually the brick crumbles. And then you have access to anything.
These were all masonry, just brick forts.
Yes, and a lot of these forts were made prior to rifle cannon. So they're looking at, sort of like ball cannon, and you can go through it and confront. The thing is, on the coast, the masonry forts hold up better for storms hurricanes, longevity, and things like that. It's not as labor intensive as like Fort Fisher, where after every storm, you have to have manpower go up there and put sand back in, you know what I mean? And that's why it was sat since the Mexican War, did nothing for like almost 10 years, just sat there. The bricks were so good. The bricks that Carl Chase made, and sold. All right, anything else? All right, hope you guys learned a little bit and knew a little bit of trivia, so in case anybody asked you, where the Civil War could have started, Fort Pickens, Pensacola, Florida. All right, thank y'all.